to get you through what we have left, I know that we did not get a meet last night, so I wanted to record the final session. It's very short. This is actually section 13 of the course, but this will close it out. This probably isn't going to take us more than about 30 minutes. I'm going to take you through it fairly quick so you guys can see what you're looking at when you go back and review the video here. Same thing as always. Let's open in prayer because you might see this. We'll open in prayer. Father, I thank you for the opportunity to have studied American military history. I pray for these cadets that they will learn much from it and vision will be put into their hearts. Lord, bless us from wherever we go from here. In your holy name we pray. Amen. Okay, so picking up right on page 13 right here, we were going into Operation Desert Storm because we got all the way through tearing down the wall. So let's actually technically run back half of 12, Operation Desert Storm. So very briefly, January, February 1991, the nation of Kuwait, correction, the nation of Iraq had actually, I did not Google this one, so give me 1 second to pull it up. Let me share my screen. That'll be helpful because we'll be going into a few things here. Hang on. I've got a number of this stuff together, but let me pull up map of Operation Desert Storm so you guys can see it very quickly what happened here. Map of Operation Desert Storm. Okay, so let's see here. Images, maps. No, I'm gonna go to images. Let's go back one. Hang on. Let's go to images. There we go. Okay, I have some of this together. All right, so what happens? Actually, I do have this map. I'm sorry, I do have this. I just have it in a different. I have it for the other. Let me minimize that. Okay, so let's go from the beginning. So Operation Desert Storm begins. Where is the map? Testimony, smoke. Battle of, there it is, 72 Easting. Supposed to have been in here, so I didn't have it up. Let me pull it up again. Map of Operation Desert Storm. Okay, let's bring this in because this is going to be important. Images. I'll pull this map up right here. This is a good map. Okay, so Operation Desert Storm. In December of 1991, Iraq invades Kuwait. So let me pull up a map so you can see that in scale. This isn't quite the map I need for that. Let's see if I can see the invasion of Kuwait. Yeah, here you go. Perfect. This is a good scale. So Iraq, this nation here, led by Saddam Hussein. We talked about this briefly last time, how Saddam Hussein killed the crown prince, took over the country, and he was an equal opportunity oppressor. But he invades and captures Kuwait. This causes actually an outrage, believe it or not, in the Middle East. So normally, according to the Quran, the Muslims are opposed to the West, but in this case, they were actually opposed to Saddam Hussein because he actually took over and invaded a fellow Arabic nation. When he did this, Saudi Arabia, which interestingly enough was on the disavowed list for terrorist activities, actually supports the Westerners and becomes a base of operation for us to launch a counterattack into Iraq and Kuwait. We also get help from the Jordanians. Syria and Iran are noticeably quiet actually in this point, but Saudi Arabia, ironically, and Egypt as well is very vocal in our favor, which is actually very interesting. So what happens on Desert Storm is we mobilize a national force. And this is really critical to understand what happens. This is the one time, if I hadn't covered it already, the T-72, so I'm going to show you these two tanks. So this is the T-72. The T-72 tank was the mainstay tank of the Soviet Union. They exported this tank heavily. The T-72 was generally used by a number of third world nations, most heavily by Iraq. It was a very good tank, or thought to be the top tier tank of the time. It really was. And no one had actually ever tested against what had just recently been fielded was the M1 Abrams. We had been up to this time using M60 tanks, and for a good portion of the war, they had actually used M60s. But this tank, which is our modern tank now, the version that we have out now is like the M1A2 SEP version 3 or something like that. It's a considerable distance from this. But this tank was untested. And in fact, they weren't sure whether or not this tank would actually be able to perform well up against the T-72, but it performed so exceptionally well. There were reports from my own platoon sergeant, because I actually took command of my first tank platoon. Um, well, the one time I took command of the tank platoon was in 1993. So these guys had just been back from Desert Storm a couple of years, and most of the combat veterans were still in the unit at that time. I remember my platoon sergeant very specifically told me about he was actually in an M60. Um, actually, correction, different platoon sergeant. Platoon sergeant that I'm going to tell the story was in an Abrams. He came across the berm attacking a Soviet tank platoon, and the tank platoon actually fired at him. They actually had an ambush against him, and they got a near belly shot. They hit him here on the front glacis, but from a below slope. They actually hit him slightly from below. They couldn't penetrate the tank. They actually had one of the rounds hit the compensating idler arm and stop the tank in its tracks. But the gunny was able to traverse his tank, fire 3 rounds. He killed every one of his enemies. He actually killed 2 of them. He stopped short of killing the third one. But he actually put a round through the front of the berm they were hiding behind, which was an 8-foot dirt berm, and out the back of the tank. That's how effective our ammunition was. Up to this point, the saber rattling coming from the Soviet bloc countries, or the countries that had been backed by the Soviets, was quite substantial. After this war, after Operation Desert Storm, which was a 4-day operation, all it was 96 hours long. We so thoroughly defeated the Iraqi tank, the Republican Guard. We so thoroughly defeated them and so quickly that all of the saber rattling came to a very abrupt end. It was a major turn in the military highlight, because nobody knew for sure what was going to happen. Prior to that, we were all preparing to fight Fulda Gap. We were prepared for a strong Soviet military. After the T-72 was defeated so easily by the Abrams at such a large scale, and a lot of that occurred at the Battle of 72 Easting, which I'll talk about that briefly as well. All of a sudden, the landscape changes. So the political landscape, because the Soviet Union, now Russia, loses a lot of its military. I'm looking for the word, but it's military prestige that it had worldwide, because all of a sudden it's vaunted armor that they had been talking about for many decades, how good they believed their armor was, had been defeated. And not many decades, a few decades, that they had said was top of the line armor. It got crushed in the desert by the Abrams, and that changed the face of the war between us and Russia. It made them a lot more negotiable in a number of areas, because they realized they could have been in a lot of trouble had they actually attempted to go to a kinetic war with us in Europe and face head to head against the Abrams. So that was a major change. The big battle that actually occurred was the Battle of 72 Easting. Let me show you the war just so you can kind of have a concept of how it went down. This was the sequence. Skip that. We'll come back to this in a minute. Battle of Mogadishu. We'll come back to that. So where is it? Thought I downloaded it. Okay, let me find it in here. That's the M1. There's the T-72. Here's the map right there. Okay, so what happens in this war, it's a very short war. It lasts 96 hours. Let's see. This map here will work as good as any. That's perfect. What happens is basically there's a joint coalition force. As you can see, there's Brits, there are Egyptian forces, there are even Syrian forces, but there's Saudi, Kuwaiti forces, there's Marines here. The major armored divisions are here, which are the bulk of the combat power. The Army brings the entire Second Armored Division. They bring a lot of combat power to the table, and there's some other Arab forces over here. What happens is the Marines end up being sort of the blocking force, so to speak, was not even really blocking force. They attack across the breach in an effort to, yeah, to pin the enemy, to hold them in place as they come across the breach. There's a giant minefield spread across here, and they go through breaching operations, which is designed to hold the enemy in place, the Iraqi army in place. At the same time, this map is not quite wide enough, so I think I have a second map. Let me go find a better map. That actually gets the whole scope and scale of the thing. This might be a little bit better. Let's see, where was the other map I had found earlier? There it is, this one right here. Okay, so this map I think goes a little deeper. The Marine Corps holds this gap here, and the Army basically does an end around run. So they go all the way deep with all. Look at all these divisions, these airborne divisions, these armored divisions. Look how many armored divisions we have here. Let's see if I can zoom in, make that bigger. There's the first armored. There's the second armored. There, this is the first Cav Brigade. All of these units. There's the Big Red One, First Infantry Division. All of these guys are now they're mechanized and armored brigades, but they're all doing a flank attack on a giant sweeping arc. What they're hunting for is the Iraqi Republican Guard. The Iraqi Republican Guard was attempting to retreat its way back out of Kuwait and work. The Iraqi Republican Guard was the elite troops of the Iraq Army. Understand that most of the troops in the Iraq Army are poor quality troops. I've trained with them. I can tell you that firsthand. They're generally very poor quality troops. But their best troops, their best trained and most loyal troops were with the Republican Guard. And they had their best equipment, which is most of their tank divisions were in the Republican Guard. And what the idea was, General Norman Schwarzkopf was in charge of the whole campaign, was he wanted to draw out the Republican Guard and defeat it in open combat. We would use combined arms against it. We could bring aircraft, we can bring helicopters, and we could bring tanks to defeat it. And remember now, when Schwarzkopf was starting this battle, he wasn't 100% certain that the Abrams could perform very effectively against the T-72. We believed it could. He probably had better information than most of us. But nevertheless, there was a lot of question whether or not the T-72 would perform as well as the Abrams in the fight. Well, they pulled the Republican Guard out, and Captain, I believe it was Captain at the time, Captain H.R. McMasters, understood the commander's intent. He actually ran into an interesting situation where he was pushing so aggressively forward as a cavalry commander. And he found the Republican Guard and he pushed into him so quickly, his battalion commander was trying to pull him back. But he understood the commander's intent to pull them out. And as soon as we found them, to pin them and make them engage, that he pushed forward. He disobeyed his battalion commander because he knew the brigade commander and the army commander's guidance was to continue to do the push. And he pushed them, and that forced the Republican Guard to turn and fight. And surprisingly, even just that one company of tanks and Bradleys that McMasters had sliced through the enemy so quickly and so decisively that it shocked the world. And then right behind it came the rest of the armored divisions, and they crushed the 200,000 man Republican Guard. They just destroyed it. All of a sudden, Iraq collapsed very quickly. Saddam Hussein, we actually rolled all the way up to Baghdad. We were not going to invade Baghdad. The president at the time was President George Herbert Walker Bush. This was the first of the two Bushes. So you had Herbert Walker Bush as the senior. You have George Bush, or W. Bush, is the junior. And Herbert Walker Bush has a very famous quote because they asked him in an interview, why did we not invade Baghdad and occupy Iraq? His response to that was to have occupied Iraq would have involved us in a bottomless quagmire from which there's no foreseeable withdrawal strategy. He understood that if you're going to invade and occupy a country, you need to be there for probably 100 years to change the culture. Otherwise, you're just in a police action that you're going to lose. We learned that lesson in Vietnam. It was a police action. We couldn't hold on to it. And without the support of the people, you won't be able to. So he knew that would be a bad idea to occupy Iraq. Interestingly enough, his son, years later, in Desert Storm, when we go back up 10 years later, 12 years later, and we occupy Iraq, we run into those exact problems that Bush Senior had said we would, and that got us stuck into a occupation force for over a decade that cost us a lot of casualties with no real results. So anyhow, that was Desert Storm very briefly. And what that does is that brings, interestingly enough, on the heels of that, in December of that year, so within 12 months of that, the Soviet Union announces its demise. It actually collapses, and some of that has to be given credit to the Operation Desert Storm. There's a lot of other things going on, but that's key. All right, that brings us up to the top of page 13, the last section. And we got to digress for a minute. I want to talk about the civil rights movement. So you understand what's going on. Now this goes back. Remember back. Let's turn the clock back for a second. We're going back to the 50s and 60s. We talked about Reconstruction coming out of the war between the states. We talked about that was a period of time where there was real, genuine racism. It was real. It's not make believe like it is today, where they come up with phony racism, or there's very small pockets of racism left today. Back then, there were large, overt racism. And I want you to see it so you know what you're looking at. First of all, they had these things called Jim Crow laws. Jim Crow, let me close these so I know what I've done. Okay, so actually I need this picture again. I'll hold on to that picture because I'm gonna need it again. We go back into Iraq the second time. And I think, yeah, perfect. Okay, come back to that. Okay, so Jim Crow was these were segregation laws. This one picture right here really kind of describes it. This picture alone, yeah, there were white and colored restrooms. So colored was the name that was given to black people in the United States, and of course white. So they wouldn't even let them go to the same restrooms. They had separate lobbies. They had separate hotels. All the things that you would think could be separate, they managed to separate. Jim Crow was he was a comedian of the day. This is this guy, right? He's a comedian of the day who made fun of black people, largely. You know, you're talking about freed slaves. He was talking about how generally they were uneducated, and he would make fun of them, and so they called him Jim Crow laws. He wasn't actually the guy making the laws. These were being made by states that would say, look, things like this, right? That there's a separate drinking fountain for the blacks than there is for the white. This is a problem. And this occurred all the way up until you'll see this all the way into the 1960s, these laws. And it takes a lot. It takes a lot of effort, largely from this man, Martin Luther King Jr., and others like him. Rosa Parks is another good one who stood up. She stood up on a bus. This kind of activity, this peaceful demonstration, was amazing. This was done in such a way that Dr. King went about it exactly the right way. Look at this crowd, though. First of all, he's in Washington D.C. You could see there's probably I'd say a few 100,000 people here in this rally, probably more because it probably goes off screen. But it's a peaceful demonstration where they basically said, "Look, we're not gonna have violent riots. We're not gonna burn down cities or anything. What we're gonna do is we're just gonna peacefully protest." And one of the bravest people was Rosa Parks, who was told to move to the back of the bus, and she simply said, "I wouldn't," and she sat down. It was a peaceful protest, and it got a lot of traction, and it changed stuff. And this made some radical changes all the way up through the 60s. Now, I was born in 1969, so I didn't really see any of this. This was really largely eradicated by the time I was, and of course, I grew up in Tucson, Arizona, so it was a little bit of a different environment. But really, a lot of this was a lot of the uh, a lot of the racism was pretty well wiped out. And coming out of that, you got a couple generations from there that we're in now that, you would, other than what the left tries to bring up and tries to force racism back in our face and try to make it an issue again, largely by, the 90s and 2000s, this was a dead issue. This was really, thankfully, we've moved far away from this and we finally had an integrated culture. And as you guys know, we have a lot of, even to the degree there's a lot of integrated families, black, white. I've adopted a black daughter. You guys know that. And so all of these, it's kind of a dead issue at this point, except that it's being brought back up. And by the way, it's interesting that they put these slides in, and here you got a Black Lives Matter, this is an abomination that this would be next to Dr. King because these guys are violent, and Dr. King was very peaceful. So it's a shame to see this. So that happens. All right, so that's going on in the country, but we're past this remember that goes all we talked about that in the Vietnam era. So that's pretty well dead at this point as we get ready to talk about the Battle of Mogadishu and we get coming out of the Cold War, right? So the Cold War is coming to an end, and we just talked Desert Storm. So Desert Storm happens in 1991. At the same time, in Mogadishu, let me get that up on a map so you guys can see where that is. Mogadishu. Mogadishu map. Let's see if it'll give us a good image of where that thing is. Yeah, you can see that off the coast of Africa here. So one place in our world that is just not let's see if I can zoom in out a little bit so you can see where that is. So this is on the Horn of Africa is what they call it. So right, so this area here is referred to as the Horn of Africa, right? That's the Horn of Africa. Mogadishu sits here. It's the capital city up there for Somalia, and largely even today, Africa is a pretty bad place overall. I mean, slavery is pretty rampant. There are warlords that run the country. They brutalize their people. I mean, it's brutal. And what had been happening in Somalia was just that there was a lot of rampant starvation happening, and America attempted to step in and distribute some food along with the UN, the United Nations, were trying to bring food to this war-torn area. And there were these warlords fighting each other. Largely, they were just terrorizing the population. But when we brought the food, the warlords would seize the food and not allow it to be distributed to the people. So they were using it as a weapon, weaponizing the food against their people to prevent them from to prevent them from rising up against them. So they would use it to, and we then therefore sent in special forces to trying to protect the food, but we weren't allowed to. The rules of engagement were very messed up. There was Democrats, I think, let's see, this would have been 91, I believe. Let's see, 93. Who was the president in 93? I think this was Clinton. Let me just see. No, not Clinton. President said that in 1993. Who was in office? I guess this would have been Bill Clinton. Yeah, Bill Clinton. So Bill Clinton was in office in 1993. I want to make sure that was correct. And they refused to actually have the right rules of engagement to put an end to this. To be fair, it was a bit of a messy situation. You want to step into the middle of a civil war, so to speak. But nevertheless, they couldn't do anything about it. So we put special forces out there. If you guys have seen the movie of Black Hawk Down, this kind of scene is repeated a little bit through the end of the Cold War, where special forces are up forward. There's no heavy forces to back them. They get drawn into a fight in the city, and they're overmatched. There's just too many enemy. I mean, the casualties that I think we didn't. I think we took something like 19 or 20 casualties in the battle, so it wasn't a lot of casualties. Let's see what the casualties were of Mogadishu. So I don't. Let's see, Battle of Mogadishu. But we inflict thousands of casualties, which that actually speaks well to our capability, quite frankly. Let's see what we'll go with the leftist media. So the leftist, anything in Wikipedia is usually not very reputable, but probably for casualty list, they'll probably be okay. So there's 160 forces for the U.S., 1,500. We took 18 casualties. That was close. They put the enemy dead at 200 and wounded at 700. I would tell you it's actually significantly higher than that. It's in the thousands. But they shoot down a couple of Black Hawk helicopters with RPGs, which is quite difficult to do, actually. They bring them down, and that forces the special forces to go into the city and stay there. There were Rangers, there was Delta Force, and then there were other Rangers, and then there was UN forces that came in and finally rescued him. But the point of this is kind of the conflict. We're not fighting a standing army, right? So there's not a government that we're actually fighting against in this case. We're fighting against essentially small scale terrorists, or actually, quite frankly, large scale terrorists and warlords. This kind of a conflict becomes very difficult for us because we're not actually trained and equipped to handle this kind of conflict. This is more of a police action than it is high intensity conflict. And we're not permitted under the rules of engagement to use high intensity warfare, right? Because you could easily roll in there with heavy troops and kill a whole bunch of people, but then you get bad press in the news and you're not really sure who you're killing because the enemy will blend into the population, much like the North Vietnamese did in Vietnam. They'll come out to fight for a while, and when they're done fighting, they'll just put on their normal street clothes and they'll disappear. And then you don't know who you're fighting. It's very difficult. And as you can see, remember we talked about this several times, fighting against an insurgency is extremely difficult. And in most cases, the insurgency wins. Even if they're much smaller, much less well equipped, you're going to see that over and over and over again. Well, we learned that in Afghanistan, right? The Afghanis beat the Russians, the Vietnamese, they defeated us. We see it in Somalia. They beat us there because, yes, unless you're willing to take extreme measures, which usually you're not, then the underdogs, so to speak, are going to win because they really have the advantages because they got the people behind them. And so, all right. So there you go. There is very briefly where that goes. So that's the Battle of Mogadishu. I want to talk briefly about another incident that comes after this, give you some concept of where we're going with this. Coming out of this Mogadishu sort of thing, there's a court martial which was interesting that occurred. And this man here, you guys remember me telling the story last week about Colonel Ripley and the bridge at Doha. If you hadn't seen that video, I know I'm going to get it hung. You want to watch this. You want to hear about Colonel Ripley. He's an amazing hero. He, however, ends up. His running mate is my mentor, Colonel Ron Ray. They have the same sort of job, just a couple of years apart. Colonel Ron Ray is actually in Vietnam, overlaps with Ripley in the same sort of advisor situation. This man, let's see here. That's Colonel Ray. We're going to come back to that. Colonel Ripley. Oops, I shouldn't close that other one. Let's see if I can find it. Let's go into the court martial of Corporal New, which I couldn't find any pictures on it. But there was a corporal, an army corporal, who was serving with the UN in the Mogadishu make sure I get this right. He's in Germany, actually, and he's ordered to wear a UN helmet. The United Nations. It's a blue helmet. If you haven't seen it, it's a UN blue helmet. It's bright blue, and it signifies that those troops are under the control of the United Nations. Well, Corporal New, a very brave soul, actually refuses to wear this helmet. He says, I never joined the UN. I didn't swear an oath to the UN. I will be happy to serve under the UN, but I will wear my uniform. Well, nevertheless, nobody knows what to do with him, so they arrest him, they throw him in the brig, and they go to court martial. It goes all the way to the President of the United States, who attempts to court martial him, President Clinton, who attempts to court martial him. Colonel Ron Ray comes to his aid and makes a successful argument that, look, we're not required as military service members to wear the uniform of a foreign government, which would be the UN. They win the case, as they should. And it sets a very interesting precedent conversation. Are U.S. troops under the command of the United States, or can they be placed under the command of the United Nations? Is that legal? The short answer, since there's nobody here to really talk through it, it's a good conversation to have. The short answer is no, you cannot legally put United States troops under foreign command. Now, to be a little bit, to do both sides of the coin here, that did happen in World War II. There were several times where General Montgomery, a British commander, commanded U.S. troops, and he gave them orders in joint operational commands. But what this distinction is that was a joint operational command. It was not them wearing a uniform. It would be, they said, hey, when they put on this uniform, you're going to wear a British uniform. They didn't make them do that. They wore U.S. uniforms while they were under British command in a joint operation. So that's an interesting discussion. You can have lots of discussions at the War College about, what can you and can you not do. But the major takeaway for you guys is if you join the military, you swear an oath to defend the United States Constitution and nobody else. That's all we're defending. And it's a really important distinction to keep in mind. All right, let me get you through a few other things. And I'm going to have to stop and probably only get halfway through this video before we got to roll out of here. Okay, on the heels of this, we begin to have a discussion around 1992 on women in combat. This is one that's really worth talking about, right? The Bible's very clear. We did this in our ethics class. The people that are to serve are men, but there's a big push to put women in combat. Colonel Ripley's testimony, and that's Colonel Ripley's the one I told you about the other day. This is him. This is Colonel Ripley, the guy. There's a picture of him at the bridge in Doha, right? Major event in the war for Vietnam. He nearly single-handedly bought the Vietnamese nation 2 more years by that action. Uh, but nevertheless, there's debate as to whether or not should put women in combat. At that time, the discussion was simply on the practicality of it, right? They really didn't discuss the morality of it, which they should have. But basically, the discussion is, you know, women could not do the jobs of men in combat. And in most cases, that's true. In almost every case, they could not perform the physical tasks. And in fact, unfortunately, I have seen both the Army and even nowadays the Marine Corps change the standards to allow women into combat roles, which is very unwise because unfortunately combat itself doesn't change, right? If you lower the standards and you let unqualified people into combat, you're doing a misservice. But more significantly, and Colonel Ripley points it out from that task, is that if you put women in with men, you have two problems. First of all, when you put women and men, you get sexual tension. It lowers the effectiveness of the unit every time. Yeah, that just I've been in units that's 100% the case. Mixed units, men and women, bad idea. Secondly, men tend to. It's just a natural because we're built this way. We're designed by God, protect women. So it's easy to put men into put them both into unfair situations because they'll be protecting the women where they shouldn't be, where they should be both performing the same task. They're just not going to be able to set that aside. And we're not designed to be setting that aside. It causes all kinds of huge problems. That's the major reason that I retired from the Marine Corps. And I got out over that issue. That's another conversation for another time. But worth reading. Colonel Ripley actually testifies on that, and his testimony carries an enormous amount of weight. He was one of two people that were asked, and you can read his testimony and what he goes over, and it's pretty impressive. But let's move a little further forward. I do want to go back to Desert Storm real quick. I forgot to show you this. This is the why, right? And actually, it's ironic. These videos are surprisingly hard to find. These pictures are hard to find on the internet. They want to dumb it down. They want to show the aftermath, but actually finding the explosions of the videos, finding the video footage. This video footage was very hard to come by. This is the video footage of church. Right? This is the live footage of the towers coming. If you ask anybody watching this, that is the Twin Towers collapsing. I mean, extremely scary. Okay, so December 11th, 9/11, right? December 11th, 2001. Um, 4 aircraft actually were used. They hijacked some airplanes. you need to know this history because this affects a lot of stuff. This was Al Qaeda. Remember who trained Al Qaeda? We trained him. We trained him, Saddam Hussein, who trained Al Qaeda to operate against against Iran. We trained the actually this was Al Qaeda. Let me back up. This was the Afghani version of that, the Taliban. The Taliban and Al Qaeda are essentially they're offshoots of the same terrorist groups. We trained the Taliban to defeat the Russians in the Russian Afghan war in the 80s, right? So we taught them how to do that. Those now they just Osama bin Laden unleashes that and turns it against us. So he turns it against us, and we go to war, and we create a resolution war, and we begin to fight. Let me explain what we did create, though. So we clearly had. You got to understand, this was shocking. Some 4,000 people were killed in those towers. Yeah, 4 aircraft. They tried to hit the Pentagon. They did actually hit it. They took out one wing of it. Fortunately, the damage was relatively light compared to the Twin Towers. And 2 aircraft hit the Twin Towers. I got to watch them live on TV. I haven't even looked at the TV when it's occurring. Really shocking. Anybody my age, you ask them where they were, they'll be able to tell you all kinds of stories about it. And I can tell you the stories about that, what happened thereafter, where I was in the Marine Corps at the time. But you can hear those stories. And America was outraged, and rightly so. This was like Pearl Harbor. It really was. It was even at the same scale. We just weren't losing military equipment. We lost more lives, actually, in 9/11 than we did in Pearl Harbor. Okay, so we then create a resolution of the Continental Congress. Now, we go so far overboard in this resolution. Let me show it to you. This is the resolution. Let me read it to you. Whereas on September 11th, 2001, acts of treacherous violence were committed against the United States and its citizens. And whereas such acts render it both necessary and appropriate that the United States exercise its right to self-defense and to protect the United States citizens, both home and abroad. And whereas in light of the threat to the national security and foreign policy of the United States posed by these grave acts of violence, and whereas such acts continue to pose unusual and extraordinary threats, whereas the president has authority under the Constitution to take action to deter and prevent acts of international terrorism against the United States, that I disagree with because that's not in the Constitution. It's in the War Powers Act, different. That the president, now notice this, the president is authorized to use all necessary and appropriate force against those nations, organizations, or persons he determines planned, authorized, committed, or aided the terrorist attacks that occurred on September 11, 2001, or harbored, and so on it goes. So and they cite the War Powers Resolution, which, by the way, is not a constitutional document. You can't use an act of Congress to supersede the authorities of war given in the Constitution to the Congress. So you can't do that. So it's actually technically an illegal document, but nevertheless, it's followed. And this constitutes the global war on terror. This gives the authority, which technically is still, I don't know, to my knowledge, it still hasn't been repealed. This brings us to 20 years of war, basically. And off we go. That having the discussion about that document is extremely important. That's an extremely powerful document. The fact that it was so easily passed, when you get a heightened sense of people that have been injured so wrongly, it's easy to get them to approve, well, quite frankly, just about anything. Okay, so we then begin to invade Iraq again, and I'm going to pause it here because I've got to get through some other stuff. So I'm going to stop this video. This will be section 1, and I'm going to go back later and we're going to finish up the rest of this. So let me go ahead and stop, and then I'll pick up here on the War on Terror, part 5 later on.